Phase 2 of the Seekers of the Storm update has been out for a couple weeks now, and with it came some much needed balance changes to the new items. I'll be making a separate video discussing my thoughts on the new update overall, but this video is solely about the item balance changes. I think the changes were received pretty well in general, but there were definitely some people that felt the changes were too harsh or even completely unnecessary. Some people may find nerfing items in a game like Risk of Rain 2 confusing, as it's predominantly a single-player game, and the multiplayer is co-op. Who cares if the new items are overpowered? It's not like anybody is getting hurt by that, right? The point of this video is to argue why most of the balance changes are warranted to at least some degree, and then propose some discussion on why nerfing things in a single-player game, like Risk of Rain 2, is sometimes necessary. I'll go through each item's changes and explain why I think the change is or isn't good, or whether or not the change makes sense. With that said, let's get into it. I don't think this is a hot take by any means at all, but Unstable Transmitter absolutely needed to be changed. The way it used to work is that if you took any damage below 25% of your maximum HP, you would get the barrier and activate the bubble on a 45-second cooldown. When I say any damage, I mean any. It didn't matter if you took 1 billion damage. If you had Unstable Transmitter off cooldown, you would survive. So, in essence, it functioned like a Dio's best friend that saved watches and potions and gave you barrier on a 45-second cooldown. Thankfully, the one-shot protection was removed, and some of the barrier that the item granted was also removed. It also no longer works on a cooldown, but rather is consumed upon use and regenerates at the start of the next stage. In its current state, Unstable Transmitter functions like a regenerating power elixir that saves both elixirs and delicate watches, with some added barrier. The teleporting bubble is mostly useless, which I honestly think is a real shame, considering that the teleportation is kind of the defining characteristic of the item, you know? If I could change it, I would remove the bubble's ability to bleed enemies and instead grant the player some extra temporary armor while the bubble is active. I think this would solidify the item's niche as a defensive, consumable item. Overall, I think the changes to Unstable Transmitter were certainly justified and are a step in the right direction. I honestly have no idea what exactly changed about this item. The patch notes say that the gold to XP ratio was rebalanced, which I can only assume means that it takes longer to reach max level with the item. Before this update, you could reach the maximum level of 94 really quickly with Long-Standing Solitude and a good combination of other items that grant gold. So I don't really know if it was buffed or nerfed, but either way, it's a lunar item. The way I see it, it's entirely up to you whether you want it in your run or not, so if it's broken, I don't really care either way. Plenty of other lunar items are completely busted, so balancing this one wouldn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Here we go. This one is probably the most controversial change in the whole update, not even just among the item balance changes. Pre-Phase 2, this item granted 7.5% movement speed per stack, which is the same as a Mocha, along with spawning the orbs that give you additional movement speed. Post-update, it no longer grants this base move speed. This one definitely hurts a lot, and I can understand why people would be upset about it. I kind of was too. Elusive Antler's pre-update gave so much movement speed, especially on the first stack. You got so much value out of this item with one stack and the max orbs collected. You had more movement speed than a red whip, which is a green item which also requires you to not attack in order to get the speed. Now, it's not unreasonable for white items to be outright better than green items. In fact, I'd say it's actually pretty common. But I think Gearbox's vision for Elusive Antlers was always for it to be a supplement to your speed in a build and not a replacement. When you look at it this way, Elusive Antlers is totally fine. It grants slightly better speed than a red whip with just one stack, and the orbs are pretty easy to manage. At least from my experience, it kind of feels like you pick the orbs up when you need them. And in combat, you kind of don't get them. It almost functions like a white red whip, if that makes sense, but it's still better than red whip in a few ways. I think overall it's good that this can't be your only speed item, the same way that Red Whip can't be your only speed item. After elusive antlers, we're back to a change that I think most people can probably see the reasoning behind. Pre-update, Growth Nectar would give you a 7% increase to all of your base stats per buff, up to 4 buffs. Stacking Growth Nectar is where the trouble came in. For each stack, the base stat increase was upgraded by another 7%, and 4 more buffs could be counted. Depending on how many buffs you could rack up, this made Growth Nectar exponentially more valuable for each stack. It was totally insane. It gave you damage, speed, health, regen, armor. It was amazing, especially when stacked. It was kind of cool because you could... The fact that there was a red item that gives you speed made it so that benthic bloom was a lot more viable. And the fact that you could get several stacks of it because of benthic bloom upgrading a green into Growth Nectar was really cool, honestly. By itself, Growth Nectar being stacked is just... it was way too good. Just to be clear, Growth Nectar is still really good. It's just a lot less potent when you stack it. You get 4% per buff, and stacking it does not increase how much each buff is worth. It only changes how many buffs you can get with Growth Nectar. I think this makes sense overall. Most red items are pretty bad when you stack them, except for a few of them, and that's fine considering you typically won't be able to stack red items very much during a non-looped run. You usually get, like, you know, somewhere between 2 and 6 is like a pretty average amount, I think. And that's fine. Your first Growth Nectar is still really strong. It's a 16% increase to all of your base stats at max capacity, which is pretty good. This is a pretty small change, but it's honestly more of a buff than a nerf, really. Pre-update, Warped Echo reduced an instance of damage by 30% and split the damage into multiple ticks depending on how many stacks you had. Post-update, the damage reduction was bumped down to 20%, but each damage tick now benefits from items like Razor Wire, Planula, and other on-hit items. This is nice as the damage ticks can be blocked by tougher times and reduced by Repulsion Armor Plate, and the damage will trigger Razor Wire, which grants the item some offensive capabilities. This is still a pretty niche use case. I think it's still primarily damage reduction, but it is more interesting now that you have this sort of synergy with Razor Wire, which since Razor Wire doesn't care about how much damage you took, it just will deal damage if you take any damage at all. It makes Warped Echo a little more unique than the other defensive bubble items, in my opinion. This is another insanely busted item that got understandably smushed. Pre-update, the missiles from Warbonds could proc items like the bands and ATGs. Post-update, it cannot proc items anymore. The proc coefficient was changed from 1 to 0. The additional base cost of the missiles is mostly negligible, in my opinion. The nerf to the proc coefficient absolutely needed to happen. Pre-update, if you had a band and a crowbar, and you had Warbonds, it basically nuked every boss. Pretty much guaranteed a phase 1 kill on Mithrix. It's still a red item. It wasn't something that you would run into all the time, but the fact that it was so strong with so little. There are a lot of other red items that are really strong, but they're really strong if you have some other stuff to go with it. Like Soulbound Catalyst is amazing. Far and away the best item you could find if you have like 5 other items, like daggers, you need Forgive Me Please, and all the other on-kill items pretty much. Warbonds, you need like 2 things, and it will nuke bosses for free. It's still pretty good, even without being able to proc items, because it deals damage proportional to boss HP, so it's always going to be about as useful from when you get it to the end of the run. But it doesn't really give you a free win by itself, and I think that's the better way for it to be. Breaching Fin is interesting to me just because it's an item that's pretty good most of the time, but not always. I'm not going to get into it here. but pre-update, Breaching Fin gives a 20% damage increase to an enemy that is currently in the middle of being juggled. Post-update, the first juggle only gives 10% damage, but each subsequent juggle gives another 10% damage. I think this makes the item require a little more effort to get all of the damage out of it, but technically it's a buff because it's now up to 30% at when you've used all of your juggles. Plus, the more you stack it, the more you can keep adding on these 10% damage increases. I think this is mostly a good thing, as it more effectively incentivizes players to continue juggling and getting more and more damage, rather than just getting all the benefits on the first bounce and then not really caring after that. The stacking is better because continuing to bounce enemies actually is really useful because it keeps adding damage, and they go higher and might take fall damage. Basically, in short, they changed it so that it's more effort for more damage, which I think is a good change. Alright, here's the change that had me scratching my head. Pre-update, Bolstering Lantern gave 10% attack speed per enemy within 20 meters, and post-update, it only gives 7.5% attack speed per enemy, basically half of a soldier syringe. This change confuses me because I don't really see why it was needed. Bolstering Lantern never really struck me as overpowered or anything like that. I mean, sure, it gives good amount of attack speed at max stack, meaning there's at least 4 enemies within your 20 meter bubble. But for a lot of characters, having that many enemies nearby is generally not good. You can have drones and that counts for the buff, but that's kind of unreliable just because drones AI are pretty stupid. And additionally, some characters just don't benefit from attack speed that much. Mercenary is the first survivor that comes to my mind where I don't, depending on what loadout I'm running, I don't want attack speed a lot of the time. This is because of the advanced technique called transfer tech, where you transfer the exposed debuff from your third swing in the melee combo into either your secondary or your utility with the dash. If you're not using that, then attack speed is totally fine, and Bolstering Lantern is great for Mercenary. But if you're trying to do this technique, which a lot of players will, just because adding additional stacks of expose is really powerful, you won't want this attack speed. Other characters like Loader and Railgunner and Acrid don't really benefit from the attack speed that much. It's not like it's useless on them or bad even, it's just like not required, right? You don't need it. It's just kind of nice. The other thing is for characters that do like to have attack speed, a lot of them don't want to be that close to enemies. Think Commando or you know Huntress. Do I want to be within 20 meters of 4 enemies? Especially, like, imagine this. It's like late game, and, you know, there's brass contraptions, elder Lemurians, parents. Do you want to be within 20 meters of them or closer for 30% attack speed? Probably not, right? It's probably not a good thing to go for. I'm willing to accept that maybe I'm just a hater and I don't see the potential behind this item, but personally, I don't think it needed to be nerfed, as I don't think it was really that strong in the first place. This item has been consistently dunked on every update since Seekers of the Storm released. It's totally understandable why it's been nerfed so much, it's just kind of funny. This item is now supposed to drop white items more often than other rarity items, which I thought it already did. At least from what I remember pre-update, I never noticed Sonorous Whispers being particularly lucky with its drops. I don't think I saw a red drop more than once or twice, and greens were fairly uncommon, and I played a lot in this time. I feel like I would have noticed, because I feel like I got Sonorous Whispers pretty frequently, all things considered, and I really... Maybe it's just because I don't loop, but I really did not see it drop anything super special most of the time. But either way, it makes sense that this was changed, just because you're getting extra items for something you already have to do, which is killing enemies and bosses. You know, you already have to do that. Getting more items on top of it just for, you know, playing the game is good. And the thing is, even if Sonors mostly just drops white items, that's fine. You know, a lot of white items are really strong when you stack them. Sometimes they're better than green or red items, especially when they are stacked. So it's not even necessarily a nerf that it prioritizes white items. It's actually, I think it's totally fine. It's like, obviously it's like, oh man, I can't get a clover from my, it's very unlikely that I'm going to get a clover from my sonorous whispers, but it's like, honestly, that's fine. I don't think it's a big deal. After looking through the changes and playing with these items for yourself, you may be of the opinion that these nerfs are bad for the game and they make it less fun. After all, it was fun to get these items and feel how strong they were and feel how much impact they had on your run. Why change these items to make them feel less impactful, less satisfying to pick up? In my opinion, it's about the overall experience of playing Risk of Rain 2. If you feel like the changes to the items suck and you feel less excited to pick them up now, that is totally justified and understandable. I also felt this way when the update first dropped, especially with items like elusive antlers. It really hurts that elusive antlers is not this universal item that is consistently good and will make up for, you know, a lack of speed in your build, because it can't really do that anymore, especially for characters that like to be in the air a lot. Think like Loader or maybe Acrid a little bit. Elusive Antlers is not going to carry you in terms of speed anymore, but I think this is actually, that's okay. Ultimately, I think the diminished satisfaction of picking up some of these items is a necessary expense in order to preserve the overall experience of playing Risk of Rain 2. Risk of Rain 2 is meant to be challenging to some degree, at least at first. It's meant to feel really satisfying when you win a run because you overcame these big challenges and these, you know, these obstacles throughout your run and you won in spite of them. That's, at least to me, that's what always feels most satisfying about winning when I play Risk of Rain 2, is that, you know, despite everything that the game threw at me, I still managed to make it out. And this feeling of overcoming what the game throws at you is tarnished by things like unstable transmitter, at least pre-update. To me, it doesn't really feel like I conquered the planet of Petrichor 5 when I had an item that would save me from dying every 45 seconds. Or, you know, an item that will just drop a nuke on a boss and kill it in, you know, one shot. It doesn't really feel satisfying to win like that. And you might argue that there are some other items in the game that also really hurt this experience, you know, in a pretty similar way. And you're not wrong. You know, Plasma Shrimp Polyloot is a thing, and it basically guarantees that you at least have a really good run. And it's not that unrealistic to get. It's not something you'll get every run, but it's something that you can consistently look for, and it will always be helpful. Unfortunately, the reality is that Gearbox is not going to change the items that were part of the game before they took over. They're only going to change the items that they added themselves, and I think I actually appreciate this approach because it makes sense. They don't want to mess with items they didn't create or balance, which, you know, people already like them in their current state. People like things like Plasma Shrimp Polyloot. It's fun. Instead, I think they're trying to make the problem of the game's difficulty not be worse, at least on their own account. So they're balancing their own items so that they can at least not make the problem worse. You know, for a while after the items were reworked from Seekers of the Storm the first time around, I can confidently say that the game was way easier than it was before. You know, the new items were they were super fun to play with. It was awesome to play with these items that were mostly horrible. They were terrible before, at least most of them. It was fun to play with them now that they were really good, but they were also, they felt too strong. I almost felt guilty sometimes for picking them up and being like, well, that's my damage, pretty much. There's most of my run right there. It's kind of like using lunar items to do your climb in Eclipse. I don't mean any offense to people who have done this, but I think you would agree with me in saying that lunar items make Eclipse a lot easier, at least some of them. Is it still as rewarding to complete Eclipse, a game mode which is meant to be a really difficult challenge that you have to work at for a long time, using these items that make half the modifiers obsolete? Personally, I don't really think so. And the same is kind of applicable to the DLC items pre-nerf. It nerfing these items does hurt, and I don't blame anyone for disliking the changes because the old balance was fun. That said, I think it was entirely necessary to preserve the overall level of difficulty that Risk of Rain 2 is meant to have. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening to me rant. I would love to hear your opinions in the comments, as this video is just my opinion on a fairly controversial topic. There's not necessarily an entirely right or wrong answer when it comes to things like balance in video games, so it's always interesting to hear other people's thoughts. That said, that's all I've got for now. Stay tuned for more Risk of Rain 2 content on this channel, coming very soon.